Providence. So you two are on the mean streets of Providence, the city we love, the naked city.
Yeah, I'm in the basements of Providence, but close enough.
They're close enough. Well, we're trying to merge two formats tonight, Brian. So I appreciate you calling in. We're trying to merge streaming video, a la Go Local Live, with the harsh realities of talk radio. So thanks for giving us a shout tonight. Dare I ask, Brian from Exeter? Mm-hmm. I'm cringing. I'm in the crash position. All right. What's on your mind tonight?
Right. Well, Little Bird told me that you guys were interested in talking about energy.
I am.
And seems to be the topic du jour.
Right.
And, forgetting, look, the particular project in Burrville you and I have crossed swords on,
Mm-hmm.
The broader topic of energy came up because National Grid had essentially a ministerial duty, effectively, to report to the Public Utilities Commission, what kind of last resort or so-called standard offer service would cost over the next 6 months.
Right.
And that's caused everybody to have a cow.
Mm-hmm. Literally.
And
if we could just point out that, so what happened was that the PUC approved 16 to 21% increase in everybody's electric bill.
Right.
Right. Absolutely. But essentially, this was, look, there are things that happen at the PUC that I think, are disappointing, or, somebody got a call, or, they saw the thing on the wall. This is not one of those times. This isn't a question of like that the PUC, would listen to people saying, well, what did everybody say at the hearing? I don't want to pay higher electric bills, right? That's not the point is all that National Grid is doing in this regard is passing on their competitively bid service, and they put those bids out every 6 months. And the bids have gone through the roof because we have been shutting down power plants. Mm-hmm. Forgetting which ones you want to build, we've shut down Brayton Point, we shut down Pilgrim Nuclear, or we shut down Salem. Now, not each of those nukes has actually come offline. One of them has, and now Brayton is offline. But these decisions are in the pipeline. The auctions that created the rates that we're seeing happened 3 years ago, based on the fact that these generators have a responsibility, and they do alert the grid when they are no longer going to operate these large electric plants. And then consequently, the auction for capacity. These auctions are for capacity. It's a kind of, it's not that complicated of a concept, but it's not for the energy itself. Basically, these are the capacity are agreements by generators that they will be available during a certain year. So in other words, they get paid a certain amount of money to be available, to make sure that the grid doesn't collapse for lack of enough electricity. And it doesn't mean that they will be generating every second during that year. It means that what they are committing to, if they receive capacity payments, is to be available to generate. And this is a decision that's made 3 years hence, and so these very high capacity auctions started taking place back in 2013.
Right.
And anybody who knew anything about about how the electric market works would have known that rates were going to go through the roof this year, because that auction was for the rates that commence in June of this year.
Now, why do you think, and you're right, this is essentially a reflexive approach built into law based on if X happens plus Y, you get Z. Why do you think the chattering political class, like Gina Raimondo, is responding the way she is? Is it pure pandering, or is it...
Look, it's 100% pandering. What I will give Gina, for the many things, look, she should pull us out of the regional greenhouse gas initiative. That would be number one. You want to lower electric rates? Pull out of the regional greenhouse gas initiative. Okay? That's costing us a lot of money. It's not what caused the particular increase, but remember, people are upset by this increase because our rates were already among the most expensive in the country.
Yeah,
And
Brian, please say that again. That's so important. Our rates are already like the second or third highest in the country here in Rhode Island, isn't that right?
Right, exactly. And so what Gina could do, if she cares, is pull out of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And we would start saving money. Wouldn't be tomorrow because, die has been cast, contracts have been made. They could put legislation in and basically cancel our contract with Deepwater. It was essentially a legislatively awarded fiat, and just as they changed the pensions, they could go back and renegotiate that. There are a number of things that she could do if she cared about electric rates. Instead, she like wrings her hands and goes, "Oh, those horrible guys at the PUC," and who have absolutely nothing to do with it. All they have to do is to make sure that National Grid wasn't, there wasn't some fraud committed in the bid. National Grid took bids under a very carefully regulated algorithm that the PUC regulates the nature of the offerings, because when you get the standard offer, you're not really buying. People say, and journalists say for convenience, that customers of National Grid will be paying more. That's not true. You're really a customer of the standard offer, which is to say that you haven't gotten off your duff and chosen an electricity provider. That's not to say there are some out there offering teaser rates, but that's not to say that's just an answer to high prices, because those electricity providers face the same they're the same people who will also, or some of them, or the people that provide electricity to them, will bid on the standard offer. The one thing I think Gina is doing right is at least not throwing a lot of spanners in the works of the proposed new plant in Burrowville, which is, would be significant additional capacity. And the very instant rate increase that we're seeing is because of the decreases in capacity that our region has experienced over the last 3 years.
Now, explain to folks, if you will, about the Greenhouse Compact. Give us some background on that.
Well, in other words, that essentially is, and I can't remember. It wouldn't surprise me if she wasn't amongst the nutcases that went out and said, "Well, if Trump isn't going to implement Paris, I'm going to implement Paris."
Yes.
What that means is forcing plants like Brayton Point to close. Now, some people will say, "Well, it's already closed." We've been in Reggie. In other words, she didn't put us in Reggie. We've been in Reggie for some time. It was these behaviors that signaled to a plant like, you realize that plant at Brayton Point, they had just spent $500 million on those cooling towers, because it was said, and I haven't gone deeply enough into science to say whether or not I believe it was justified, but they were forced to build those towers because the warming of the waters in Mount Hope Bay by their discharge had been alleged that biologically it was hurting the spawning results, or recruitment as they call it, of various fisheries there. So they spent $500 million building those. They were only completed about 5 or 6 years ago. But this march to Reggie, this war on coal, meant that even having just made, and of course they've invested in they call it all the modern, the bag houses and the particulate control and so forth for the plant, so that in other words it was running to every standard except for this amorphous, we don't like carbon standard. That's and basically there's no way to meet that standard.
Right.
Right. So here they had just spent. Isn't this a great thing to say to a business in our region? Yeah, they spend $500 million in our region, and we adopt policies to put them out of business. Yeah, I think that's great. And so getting us out of Reggie would be a signal to businesses at the generators that we would buy, that they could invest in generating technologies to bring us a competitive electricity, and that we would not put them out of business before they had recovered the cost of building the plant.
And these were established plants that had already had a footprint in New England.
Well, that's right. Brayton Point is long established. It's the largest coal plant in New England, and it had been there, I think, going on 80 years. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, these are plants with established footprints. And as you know, I'm not. The thing is, I don't favor any one plant or any one idea. So it's not like, oh, I want the nukes, or I want this, that, or the other thing. One of the difficulties of the being in RGGI and of the various renewable standards that the state has adopted is that renewable power does not pair well with baseload power in a competitive market. So not only are we paying excessive amounts for that renewable power, because we've decreed we're going to buy it, so even if it costs more, it doesn't matter, we're going to buy it. So not only are we paying excessively for the renewable power, that renewable power has to be paired, in order for the grid to be stable, it has to be paired with peaking capability, the ability of generators to ramp up very quickly when the wind dies.
Right.
And so the problem is coal plants and nuclear plants are baseload style plants. So if you adopt regulations that bring a lot of renewables online, you make it very difficult to operate those plants in any kind of economic manner, because they're not made, those plants are not made to go from 0 to 60 every time the wind speeds up and slows down. What you're doing is you're just, look, I mean, you might as well just have made, in the same policy for renewable energy, you might as well have said, and by the way, we're going to have to build natural gas plants, because natural gas plants are much more suited to turning on quickly and ramping up. Now, I don't favor that strategy. I would have wanted a strategy that did not undercut the baseload generation we have when we don't have economical renewables, when we don't have a competitive circumstance. Look, in 20 years, things could be different. And unfortunately, the opponents of traditional generation and even a new generation, look, they're trying to nip the Achilles heels of all these projects, drag and slow them down. I don't disagree. In 15, 20 years, the grid could look different. People could be off the grid. Things could be better. Maybe there will be affordable ways to harness renewables. So people who are going to invest in generation that would lower our electric costs right now competitively, they have to see, essentially they got to be seeing like a 20-year horizon. And nobody's guaranteeing that to them. It's not that if they build a plant, we guarantee them a profit for 20 years. That doesn't happen. But they have to look at the market and what's happening. So obviously, all that the antis have to do to any of these plants is like, you just keep poking it and death by 1,000 cuts for 5 or 6 years, and maybe they won't build it because they're not sure they'll get 20 years out of it. And so that is why we're facing very high electricity costs right now. And the people complaining the loudest about it have either adopted or expressed great fealty for the very policies that have made our energy expensive.
Here, here.
Why then, and just a question, on the current ICE under auctions that are 3 or forward looking, why have there been no bidders then, or low or no bidders for some of the anticipated capacity?
So here's, in other words, you have to look at this. It's a little bit like a sine curve. So these major retirements, since we've had a competitive regional market these auctions have been going on for 10 years.
Right.
And that in 2013, there was a major nuclear closure announced. It didn't close then, but it was announced. So essentially, everybody looked around and said, where's the power going to come from? And there was X there, and the auction cutoff went from the normal capacity auction is $2, or had been, the going rate had been about $2.75 per megawatt month. Or it might be kilowatt month. Kilowatt month. Sorry. So it had been $2.75. After the announcement of that first nuclear closure, the auction closed at $7 that year. So that the lack of it meant essentially we were drawing capacity from further away. People who had to factor how to get it here, or people who had more expensive, knew they was going to be more expensive to run their plant and bid higher. And everybody bids in tiers, and when they get enough capacity, they cut it off. And that becomes the price. So the highest price at the cutoff, everybody gets it. And so it went from, essentially it tripled in 2013. you don't feel the effects until that capacity auction was for power that began to be provided in June of this year through June of next year.
Right.
And so this national grid increase, this is the first national grid period of buying the standard offer for customers that took place under those much higher capacity costs. The following year, Brayton Point closure was announced, and the rate for capacity per kilowatt month went up to $11. That's why, if you look at the news articles, it's going to cost even more in the future. Then the following year, people, it had drawn, in other words, there were announced starts and people had put in, for instance, Clear River and so forth, people had put in early bids to provide capacity 3 years out. And so that ameliorated it. Went back down to $7 in 2016. And finally, the auction this year, which I think you're referring to, a portion, half of the proposed Clear River plant cleared the auction and half didn't. And which obviously means they just strategically bid at a couple of different levels. And the auction this year closed at $5. Now, a lot of people have been opposed and have been favored renewables, say, oh, isn't that great? See, it's back down to $5. What was all the worry about? It used to be $2.75. Now it's over $5. So we had the inrush of very high prices. That brought a lot of proposed projects. And some sense that, okay, all these plants have closed, but we're going to get some new plants. If people roadblock these plants and they don't come online, it'll go right back up again.
Yet at the same time, I mean, clearly the opposition to the plan, and I'm just trying to straighten out how the market actually functions here, not really make a point either way. Sure. But at the point in time that this auction took place, where the second half of the capacity wasn't bid on, clearly it was under debate as to whether it was being built. Wouldn't a market reaction, and I'm being overly simplistic here, wouldn't the market reaction, shouldn't it have been showing a demand?
No, that's what I'm saying. The market, in other words, people strategically bid, and they can bid capacity that's not built yet, that they believe they can build within 3 years. Mm-hmm. But if they win, if their bid is under the cutoff price, and they then win the right to provide capacity, that's a right, but it's also an obligation. So if they don't get their plant built, it means they have to go out and buy capacity to substitute for the capacity they couldn't bring online. So obviously a plant like Clear River decided not to bid all their capacity at the same number. Okay, they bid some of their capacity at a number that was below the $5 price, and it came in. They bid other of their capacity at a price that was higher, so it didn't come in. It's not a question of whether people, they don't go around and kick the tires and say, do we like Clear River? In other words, it's all a numbers game. It has nothing to do with which plant. So they clearly did that, because if they had bid the whole plant and all these folks who were opposed to it somehow kept them from building it, they would have been obligated to find that much capacity themselves and go buy it regardless of the price. Regardless of the price, they were obligated to buy it. So obviously they bid some of their capacity higher, and it didn't clear the auction. And that doesn't mean that it means that they wouldn't sell any capacity for that second half of the plant. That auction was for 2020 into 21, to 2020 of June to 2020 to June of 2021. But there's another auction the next February. So again, they're going to look at, how's their project going? Is it coming along? Do they have their approvals? What's their building scale? And they're going to bid accordingly, knowing that if they win, but they don't get the plant built, they are on the hook to provide that electricity nonetheless.
Well, now, let's talk about markets and how markets should work and occasionally don't. Do you find this type of market structure appropriate and efficient?
Well, what happened was a bunch of plants said they would close. That raised the price. That's how markets work, right? Less supply, and the demand didn't go down, so the price went up. That brought people competitively into the market.
Correct.
The number of people who came in brought that rate back down. It has not brought it down to where it was before these closures were announced, and I still think it was horrible policy to have policies that forced a plant like Brayton Point to close with the kind of investment that had been made in that plant. But setting that aside, it brought people in to compete because they saw the price go way up. I mean, the same thing happens with energy all the time. I mean, I can't get natural gas where I'm at, and so I use propane. I had just looked at the market and thought, a lot of this shale gas is coming in wet, which means it has propane in it. So I think the prices for propane aren't going to be as high as they've been, and I really prefer to burn a gas product. It's easier to clean and maintain. So I buy propane. Well, 1 year, about 2.5 years ago, anybody who burns propane will recall, unless they had a lock, their price went absolutely through the roof because they had a wet harvest in Nebraska, and Nebraska was buying all the propane it could possibly buy in order to dry to dry their corn to make ethanol out of. Talk about stupidity. But this is by more. So all of the propane that we would normally buy was being taken in tanker trucks to Nebraska because they could get more money for it there. And so our propane price had to go up in order to attract some of those tanker trucks to come back.
I didn't know any of this. This is very interesting.
Yeah, no, I remember that very, very clearly because there were people here in Rhode Island who were literally out. There were all sorts of supply issues, but and largely the interesting thing about the propane market is that and you buy it, so you're more intimate with it. So correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a much more national market in scope. I mean, so my question then is, if you're looking if people are having to make judgments 3 years out based on availability of supply, and yet the propane market is that much more reflexive to availability and supply, shouldn't we be moving more into the model form of a propane market where, or say the gasoline market, where at least there's some level of supply and demand, as opposed to, I mean, you're in the natural gas, the ISO markets that you're talking about, 3 years out, there's all sorts of exogenous events that could affect them. Yet these people are being forced or locked into decisions without any chance to react. I mean, it just seems like madness.
Well, now that's because that's the side of the auction that deals. There's two sides to the auction, right? So the capacity side deals with stability, and the problem is that's why you have to announce 3 years ahead of time you're going to close a plant, and otherwise you actually have an obligation to come in, to bid into the market and so forth. So the announcements of closings control that capacity market, and it's very important for that. Look, don't put me down like as a fan of the grid.
Right.
I think in 20 years, I'm not thinking that we'll have cheap alternative energy on the grid. I'm thinking forget the grid. When they get it right, when they get storage right, when they get the technology right, I hope everybody has a couple of solar cells, a little windmill up on the roof, and some batteries in the basement, and it'll be just like heating, right? We don't buy it from a utility. We get it like the oil truck comes up to the house, or that's in this case we would do it with technology, and then in the summer. I'm not opposed to that. It's just ridiculously expensive right now, and so in the meantime, while we have the grid, they have to have these capacity decisions made ahead of time. The way that they have introduced that market element is, yes, it's 3 years out, but that market element, when the capacity prices went up, people came in and started looking at building power plants here. That's a market signal. That's what's supposed to happen. The other part of the auction is more essentially the day-to-day auction for buying the actual energy in real time as it's needed. And that auction, the rates for that are impacted by having less generators and so forth. Although because the capacity is secured, those rates tend to be affected more by the constraints on certain fuels and supplies at certain times of the year. So a generator can have an agreement to generate, but they bid based on what the fuel costs. So in the winter, we have constraints on natural gas. We don't have enough to run all the natural gas gen. This is why I think it's so stupid to have closed nuclear plants and coal plants. And again, we didn't do it, and these weren't centrally made decisions, but we created policies that made it unaffordable to run those plants, and I think that was pure stupidity. We're not ready for those plants to be gone. Maybe we would be in 10 or 15 years, but instead we ushered them out early. We're all paying the price. There's a constrained supply of natural gas in the winter, so that means that electricity customers are competing with people who are trying to heat their house.
What do you say at this point regarding, and you mentioned it earlier, offshore wind? Talk about the market rate that we're paying for that as opposed to conventional energy.
Right. Well, that's even more insane than our renewables requirements, because at least our look, if you believe that the world's coming to an end and the globe is warming and, the whole thing, whatever, if you believe that, fine. I would think that you would still want to solve that with the most cost-effective possible strategy. And we can buy wind from various wind farms in Maine for under 10 cents a kilowatt hour. Natural gas in unconstrained situations, right, when they don't have to bid against heating supply for gas. So in unconstrained circumstances, natural gas is between 3 and 4 cents a kilowatt hour. And so this wind from Maine, it's still 2 or 3 times as expensive, but it's relative. But for renewable energy, right, it's 3 times as expensive looks very good, because our offshore wind, our great demonstration, only one in the country offshore wind farm is charging us 25 cents a kilowatt hour.
Right.
Or so almost 10 times the cost of natural gas generation. And here's the great part. It goes up every year.
3.5% a year.
Right.
It goes up by a few percent a year, such that by the end of the 20-year arrangement, I won't even suggest it as the dignity of a contract, but at the end of the 20-year arrangement with Deepwater, we'll be paying 45 cents a kilowatt hour.
It's just insanity. It is
well, now
insanity.
And my words, not yours, Brian or Monique, but coincidence that the CEO of said company is a former staff member for Governor Chartier?
Oh, it makes me ill. It's the worst thing Governor Chartier ever did.
Methinks not.
And forgetting, giving out responsibility, people were all, people were rightly exercised about 38 studios. But, Deepwater Wind will cost the ratepayers of the state, who essentially are the taxpayers, right, for the most part, it will cost them about $400 to $450 million in excess costs over what we could buy that energy for from other providers. So, that was a $450 million mistake or gift, nice golden parachute for somebody coming out of his administration, whatever it was. And again, I don't mean to say that I think it was, that it was directly corrupt. It's a kind of government payoff that isn't considered to be a crime, right? Because they say they're making the right policy, and Rhode Island's going to get jobs, and you have to invest in all this stuff. And even with 38 studios, right? They don't have anybody in the dock. I thought there were a couple things around the edge that maybe they could have looked at a little harder. But it wasn't criminal. It was just stupid.
Right. Right. Well, like the Pawtucket Red Sox. It's just.
Hey, look, I couldn't agree more. And I love the quote out of Massachusetts, right, where the head of the Senate up there goes, yeah, well, it'd be great if the Paw Sox moved to Worcester, but we have a policy in the state of not paying for sports stadiums.
Right. I drive by every day a sports stadium that wildly is filled with 60,000 screaming country music fans right now. Talk about exercise and poor judgment on a couple levels, but was built largely with private money. I mean, we all know some infrastructure money went out that way, but was somehow built with private money, and astonishingly enough, it's wildly successful. But getting back to the wind, one of the quid pro quos in the wind project, Rhode Island was to become the turbine manufacturing capital of the world, wasn't it?
Oh yeah. How's that working out for you?
Not at all.
Yeah, right, exactly.
I'll put up the second. Brian, we've got a reward up there for anyone who can prove they actually paid for a Pawtucket Red Sox ticket tonight. I'll double the reward on anyone who could show me a turbine built here in Rhode Island. In fact, if I remember correctly, shortly after the announcement, the ink was dry on the agreement. The one turbine manufacturer that was here, actually, they were small, but they actually got up and moved to Fall River. I don't know why I remember that, Brian. I just do. But you know.
Oh no! I mean, look, this was talk about a pig and a poke. This idea that and look, even some people who I thought ought to be a little more clear-headed, that I knew had this we're first movers, we're first movers. We'll be this will really give us I said, look, it's not going to essentially what you're saying to people is we give out gross subsidies to do stupid things. That's what you're saying. And who really wants to do business unless they imagine we're going to keep giving out gross subsidies to do stupid things? So that's the business model. And sure, if we were willing to keep paying like these ridiculous, absurd prices that we're paying to Deepwater, and they're all out there, oh yeah, well, the next one, man, when we build a big one, it's only going to be like 15 cents a kilowatt hour. Oh, great. You mean like about 5 times the going rate for electricity instead of 10 times the going rate.
Right.
Exactly.
It's insanity. And if you have a really good look, if you're really clever, if we were a good place to do business, great. Go convince somebody we're a good place to do business, and we want you to, Quonset, great resource, good access to the Northeast and so forth. You could make your turbine blades right here, and we could put them on barges and ship them anywhere up and down the coast. And the problem is that essentially they're only going to do that if you give stupid subsidies. And here's the problem: what if they want to? If Delaware wants to build an offshore wind, or Massachusetts, for instance, do you think that they want all of that subsidy money flowing to Rhode Island? No. They're going to get their own. Oh no, we got to have our own yard here. They were ready, like New Bedford was all ready to do. They claimed, Deepwater was saying, oh, we'll get the contracts over here at Quonset to take care of Cape Wind. Well, thank God they came to their senses and didn't build that. But they already were investing state money in New Bedford to be the port from which that would be built. No state in their right mind would force ratepayers to pay these incredibly ridiculous multiples over the going cost of energy, and then not essentially force local content. I mean, actually, I think the whole thing is essentially anti-competitive and unconstitutional to boot. But that goes back to if you're a believer in renewable energy, fine, just let people compete. And whoever can offer you renewable energy the cheapest will do it. And if the only renewable energy that we have left to get around here is offshore, then the prices would have to rise to make that feasible. And that's what will happen. And then we would just have to debate, do we really need to buy that much, renewable electricity? Right now, we could get all our renewable requirements without Deepwater or without anything like Deepwater. And it's just a constant drumbeat of trying to increase those requirements, or trying to purportedly to implement, as if like Rhode Island could implement the Paris Treaty or something. And I suppose we'll start allocating the billions of dollars of payments that we're going to go to various other nations that are being prevented from developing by the Paris Treaty, unless so they'll just take billions instead from us. But if you really believe in all that nonsense, wouldn't you want to do it as efficiently as possible? That's where And there were even, I will say, and I've had plenty of jousting with environmentalists over my time because I think they worry too much about this stuff. But that said, when it came to deep water, I think even they thought that it was a bridge too far. They thought it would give renewable energy a bad name. That when the bill came due, somebody was going to turn around and blame the environmentalists. And so they actually, a number of environmentalists actually worked with us opposing that project, but, it had already been, and I mean this euphemistically, it had been bought and paid for already.
Right, no, it's, it's astonishing that the PawSox hasn't been crammed down our throat yet. I don't doubt for a moment that they aren't trying to figure out ways to do it, but if there was ever a project that had promise written all over about it, Gina Raimondo and her lawyers right now are probably huddling in the basement of Halitosis Hall, twisting their mustaches, trying to figure out how to ram the Pawtucket Red Sox Stadium through the Commerce Corporation.
And that they have not been able to do that. They have not done that. I think they see that there's not an appetite for public involvement in that.
Right.
Right. No, and I have said I have no issue myself with trying to pair the infrastructure that would be needed for a stadium if the owners of that team would build a stadium. I think, look, for them to do so, it's been the status quo. It's been the regular, right? That the sports owners come hat in hand, looking for money from the state and the city. Mm-hmm. If they were, and look, so they're trying to characterize the even purportedly moving off the dime, which is mostly just changing the deal around on paper. As an incredible sacrifice on their part. I just think that's essentially, essentially it's untrue what they paid it. They really just changed the deal from kind of rental to that their money was a payment against a part of the stadium. And the only reason that the numbers even look lower than in Providence is they haven't dealt with the parking issue.
Right.
I don't know if you've looked for the parking plan for the PawSox Stadium in the new proposed riverfront stadium in Pawtucket. They don't have a parking plan. People are going to park around Pawtucket. That's their parking plan. So they really just when everybody realized if they were to do it and nobody could park anywhere, then they'd be back telling us, oh, you got to buy them a garage. And I actually, if they would build the stadium and a garage could be put to other municipal uses, I'm not absolutely opposed to that. It was the garage. Whether you favor or disfavor, for instance, the Providence Place Mall, the only investment that the state had there was as against the cost of creating the garage and parking, which in an urban area, trying to create renewed retail and so forth in urban areas is difficult. The parking's expensive, and that was what the state actually helped with. Now, you could still say that that's a bridge too far. I'd be willing to look at the parking issue. I am not willing to look at putting Cent One into the stadium.
Yeah, the challenge, of course, is that the media in this state has all got a vested financial interest in the stadium going forward. If you look at the Journal, as I love to point out to people, and I think you'll agree, Brian, that print media, print advertising, I should say, in print media is a bygone dead concept. Yet, Twin River continues to spend money on the Providence Journal. Why? Because you can't bribe anyone. That's against the law. So you can buy useless product that essentially props up one of the leading, quote, and I'm using the coalition air quotes here, one of the leading legacy media sources, and there's no more separation, I think we can all agree, between news, editorial and the almighty dollar. I don't know if there ever has been, but, when you look at WPRO, the radio station, they've all got direct vested interest. Valley Breeze, the kind of puff reporting that's coming out of what used to be legitimate news outlets is astonishing. The glowing, loving reviews, you would think that this was literally the cornfield in Iowa. that we were talking about. And I get your point about, about infrastructure. I guess at this point, from my perspective, that the host organizations that would be forced to pay for infrastructure are so fundamentally broken.
And broke.
That they're really, the resources in my mind simply don't exist for Pawtucket to do that.
I don't, don't put me down as rah-rah with the pom-poms, but I do think also that, that there are aspects of infrastructure that actually, can serve other purposes. In other words, it's not just a veiled, look, they're trying to say that about the ballpark itself, and look, it's a baseball park, okay? And you're going to have a couple of, and who's going to? In Providence, when we want to have a festival, we have to pay for it. It's
right.
like, he wants to, it's embarrassing that Providence chased its own music scene away, so now they want to, Allures is out using our money to buy it back, and so the stadium is not, that's a private enterprise. Whether or not you could make a point that downtown Pawtucket actually does need parking, and if redevelopment there really were to be effective, and you were to have a mixed use and stuff going on, and you would need the parking, well, look, that's right. But well, we can't afford it. We have to borrow. We have to this, and those kind of arguments are made, often. And yes, I would be suspicious of if those weren't offered on kind of revenue bases and were various parties, where instead it was just all done, all imaginated in the back room with the Commerce Corporation or whatever the heck it's called this week.
Right, right. Now, and it's interesting because the other argument by the legacy media, who's got a direct vested interest in the stadium being built, is that, well, this is how it's always been done, and no one objected to I'll call it the extension, if you will, of the original Paw Sox agreement just a few short years ago. And my argument to that would be, number one, we were so relieved the stadium wasn't being built that we really largely, a newly educated opposition didn't pay much attention to the renewal of the Pawtucket agreement. But at this point in time, shouldn't the Paw Sox just start paying rent?
Right. Well, that's the that is essentially, and the deal in Providence had them paying rent and Providence would build the stadium and then they would pay rent that didn't remotely cover the cost of it.
Right.
And and they just moved that around on paper and said, oh, well, now they're paying money, they're paying half the cost of building it, but they're not paying any rent.
Right.
And then there's the question of rent on the bricks and mortar we do or don't have, and how good a shape it is or isn't in. But I'm not. Look, I would love to think that people have civic pride, and I don't mind people saying that Paw Sox have always been here. In other words, sure, there are these areas of tradition that maybe want to make us look harder or think harder about a project. You certainly wouldn't look at, say, Kurt Schilling's 38 Studios and say, well, that's an area we've always done that. It's an area of tradition. Instead, they presented that as, oh, this is the next new thing, so you got to do this. And, you could be had either way, obviously. So it's still a question of diligence and really seeing investment. Look, if the private party really builds the stadium, that is at least a signal of investment in that community, where then you say, look, could we afford to bond for some infrastructure, or might we take some funds that were aimed at one area of infrastructure and for the time being prioritize this? Maybe that's reasonable. But so far, you haven't really seen the owners of the Paw Sox put that on the table.
No, and they're desperate not to. Which is astonishing, given the fact that you're talking about a group of sophisticated investors who clearly have the reputation to gain access to the most sophisticated capital markets, literally in the world. We're talking about A-gamers here. This isn't even Rhode Island royalty. Guys like Terry Murray and Mr. Ryan have operated literally at the highest level of business on the planet. Mayor Grebian's sort of Hail Mary approach at getting a group of banksters involved this past week in form of some type of business advisory committee strikes me as a tad disingenuous, since if in fact those folks approved of the investment, they too could act as a source of risk capital, couldn't they?
Right. Well, and again, and if we ameliorate the risk, or then it's all the better for them. No, I mean, obviously, it's difficult having people who are interested, or have an interest in making the decisions. And I don't know. It's not to say that I think the thing is so wholly corrupt, but I do think it is kind of that business as usual. That's what we've seen out of the Commerce Corporation for so long. And and what we don't have is that attention to just the little engine that could, the small businesses and that that are out there every day and that don't get big tax subsidies. And
actually,
before I came on the phone, I just stopped working. I'm working to compete with people building apartments in downtown Providence who don't pay taxes,
right,
or don't pay anything like the taxes that they ought to pay,
right,
on a relative basis. And
tax stabilization agreements.
That's what I face. That's what I face every day. They come in. Oh, this is the new. We're going to fix up buildings. Oh, but by the way, they of course it's expensive to fix up a building. They can't pay any real taxes. And that's the crying shame. That's the worst part of the Providence Place Mall deal. The state subsidy. When you really dig under the hood, I don't think the state subsidy is excessive. And Aaron Garabedian and I could debate that, and there's always the question of foregone revenue. How much of this revenue is new revenue from the mall, and how much is from out of state? And of course, now all of that sector faces internet competition that nobody really had on their view screen when they did it. But the worst part about the mall is Providence, the city of Providence, gave up every cent of tax revenue for 30 years. Not just for the bricks and mortar of the mall, but all the improvements and betterments of any store in that place, which themselves are an incredible should be a serious source of revenue. And again, I don't think tax rates should be as high as they are at Providence, but if you zero those tax rates for some people, then that just makes them higher or keeps them higher for the people who are already here doing business. And so we're always about these Hail Marys for the next new business instead of about improving the morale and the results for the businesses who are here working hard.
That's exactly right.
Brian, you're intimately involved in residential properties. And I have to do a time check. I got to keep an eye on the time here. But it strikes me, and I'd love you to build on this analysis, that by artificially subsidizing the cost in the production of higher-end residential housing, as I look out here onto Waibatsa Street, right across the street, I see one where the state chose to give a rather politically connected landlord, a guy who used to be mayor of Providence, a tremendous loan, and this, I always find irony in this, because this is an individual, again, who has the financial resources to go out and get his own money. He doesn't need the state's money. People will, when your name's Palino, people will loan you money. You haven't ruined it like Trump has. You look at the tremendous amount of market activity in subsidizing high-end property, yet the constant complaint in this state is the lack of quote-unquote affordable housing. Are we artificially skewing the market towards that high-income housing, which ultimately often sits unused, away from by these type of subsidies?
Well, here's just to kind of give you the devil's advocate, because I face this argument all the time when I argue that we shouldn't be subsidizing these projects. But their kind of devil's advocacy argument is, that we have relatively high occupancy rates, and so that's essentially a market signal that we need more units. And there's some truth to the reason that we have difficulty with affordable rent, because it just goes down the line. If they build a high-end apartment downtown, right, and they're not paying taxes, And so they rent it for, they want to rent it for $1,500, right? So now one of my tenants on the east side says, oh, that's nice. That's nicer than the apartment. It's brand new. It's got granite countertops. I'm going to move down there. Okay, he moves down there. So now I got to look around, find a tenant for my apartment. So somebody who maybe had an apartment up towards Pawtucket line or something says, oh, I can get down close to Thayer Street. This will be fun. So now they come down. They pay me a little less. Then somebody who has an apartment, the whole thing goes around, and it's a very, very long game before you ever see this kind, this really create units that are affordable at the other end. Because the problem is, at some point, some units just get a cutoff of where if they have to lower their rents to attract people, the sheer cost of having them is not worth it. And that's the issue with what former Mayor Paolino would say is, if I didn't have these subsidies, I would not do this project. Well, I say, well, fine, don't do it.
Right.
It's a free country. I don't have any problem. Nobody's making you do it.
But you're speaking exactly to my message, is that this obsession with artificially, and I use the term low price luxury rentals, by building them, essentially spins the marketplace from building truly market adjusted pricing for more modest housing, and you artificially skew the marketplace against production from housing that will present opportunities at the lower end of the market. It's all.
Yeah, and the biggest problem for the low end is zoning and regulation.
Mm-hmm.
That's the biggest problem. That's what really discourages. At the high end, there's cost of building, and as soon as you take the subsidies, they try and force you to use union labor. And there's all kinds of other things that come along with this. The subsidies don't all flow to the developers. There are a bunch of other suck-ups, who get their share. But but at the lower end, it's the regulation and zoning just kills it. Here we have, all of these enormous houses throughout Providence, and many of them at one time housed families when people had, 7, 8 people in a family. They had 5, 6 kids. That's I come from a family of 6 kids, and and my dad wasn't even Catholic. So there were many great and that's the way things work. Now we have all of these, even the tenements. They were built. They had 3 bedrooms and 3. They had big tenement floors. Well, the obvious thing to do to create housing for these markets would be to take every floor of a tenement and bust it in half and make 2 units out of it.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
You got to move heaven and earth to get that done. That's considered to be a crime against humanity from a regulatory perspective.
How does
and nobody can afford to take these 3-deckers, which are all full of lead paint and all full of this and all full of that, which, again, I think people make way too much of a stink about every jot and tittle of it. Yes, you can, somebody can have a problem with it, but, the amount of craziness that you force basically, we've declared all of our housing stock to be a hazard. We've made it incredibly expensive for anybody to actually renovate or work on it, and we won't let them, when they do renovate and work on it, they, generally speaking, can't make it into units that are of a size that suits today's family size. So I think our problem with affordable housing are entirely regulatory.
By the way, as someone who has to compete against subsidies, how does it feel to pay taxes to a state that routinely gives money to essentially your competitors?
Oh, that's exactly what they're doing, you just, that's the world that we live in. I'm not going to take my bat and ball and go home. And I never say, I will tell you, I know plenty of people who've left the state. It's too bad. I enjoy it here. And we all know if you leave Rhode Island, they make a voodoo doll of you and put a magnet next to it. And so forth. So, but it's a shame to see that, and that's look. The regulation is on one side a problem. The subsidy on the other side. It means that your competition is getting subsidized. So, you face some of the same kinds of costs they do, and yet they are not paying the same tax bill you are, and it's a difficult market, but that's, you get up every day and you go swing your hammer and hope for the best.
Well, that's my argument against these gigantic subsidized entertainment entities, whether it be the Twin River, whether it be the proposed stadium, is that ultimately you're creating a climate where folks like you, who actually create wealth and create jobs and profoundly impact the multiplier effect in the local economy, are essentially paying tax dollars against their competition. I'm presenting a motion to the Cumberland Town Council that points out the fact that the creation of a subsidized stadium in Pawtucket represents a threat to the local business community in Cumberland, because you're creating an artificially unlevel playing field. You're giving advantages to a building. You're helping create a building that will seek to take the entertainment dollar away from restaurants. And the more that they argue that this stadium is going to be quote unquote year round, I believe that profoundly proves my argument that they're looking to create an entertainment venue, not just a stadium. And that's the only way.
That's exactly the argument, of course, that Aaron Garabedian made regarding the Providence Place Mall. And Aaron, for folks who don't know, owns the Warwick Mall.
Right.
And essentially, he's saying you're subsidizing my competition. There's one and essentially, I think the logic of what you are suggesting to Cumberland, can be seen loud and clear. And the thing that, of course, concerns me is that we create an absolute or an expected hierarchy. That if they would have private investment in that stadium, and we were just talking about parking and so forth, that's where I even say to Aaron, who I respect, and I'm not saying it was precisely right or wrong, but at least I see the argument that the malls came along, took advantage of the public infrastructure, the highways, to bring people to them, and they don't pay any more for the highways than any of the rest, or people in Providence buying gas or anything else. So government built the highways, that enabled the malls, and they had a lot of space for parking, and so that government policies, in other words, spurred the mall, the competitive nature of the mall by investment in government infrastructure. Now, the mall folks, of course, were taking advantage. Like, this was the wave. Highways were the wave of the future. What's the smart thing, right? You're going to build a mall out by the highway, and so they were responding to what the government. And so then, if government says, hey, maybe it wasn't the smartest idea, our last, 50, 60, 70, 100 years of policy to just drive everybody out of the city, the cities, can be dense and efficient and can create, cultural centers. That's great. So the key thing concern I have is dealing with the infrastructure difficulties that are represented by being in a city. I mean, parking is a very obvious one, and the approaches and getaways, so to speak, for stuff to happen in the city, the ability to actually be able to get to the parking. I mean, those are things that I can see government thinking about, saying, hey, if we actually want anybody to live and invest in Providence, it should have good infrastructure, and there should be places for people to park, and so that's why. But we shouldn't be in the business of saying, you know what, there's a movie theater at the mall, right? So we have to subsidize a movie theater in Providence to compete with it.
Right.
That's entirely wrong. It's you're creating that public infrastructure, the roads, which constitutionally, I'm not sure by the post roads. It's effectively, and there are some models for creating private roads for, to alleviate certain kind of commuting and larger transportation issues. But I don't have a problem with roads as a public good. And I don't even necessarily have a problem with parking as a public good. I have a real problem with, like, movie theaters as a public good, baseball stadiums as a public good.
Right.
I mean,
But I mean, it's interesting. I at the time, it's really when the mall came up, I was just starting to get political. I actually took Mr. Garabedian's side, but I took it locally. I remember in the opening weeks after the mall was built and christened, and the then, and I can't remember his name or the business, but the then head of the Downtown Providence Merchants Association closing his store and moving into the mall. So the exigent threat that I saw was not so much to Aram Garabedian, who is probably not shy about infrastructure improvements in his town either.
Yeah.
But as I sit here on Wade Bossett Street here in the Go Local Live Media Center, as I sit here and I look around the streets of Providence, and I call them the mean streets of Providence for a reason, I don't believe that the streets of Providence, while there's been fits and starts, the downtown shopping district has ever fully recovered from the competition that the mall presents. I don't believe that. Now, you're much closer to it. You're an investor in Providence, but it's you've got, again.
I mean, I think that's fair, but also we want to remember that the catalysm for things like the mall, or the sense of how to get people into Providence, was a kind of argument at that point, because that scene with the retail in Providence was already on the way out, right? The mall, you could say, the mall sealed the deal. That the people who proposed the mall said, yeah, but in the end, it's going to catalyze, I think that that as I look, what has happened in Providence, which I think is not unpositive, is the small unsubsidized gems. The people who have managed to somehow, clawing with their fingernails to stay in business there and to create neat spaces, places like the Red Fez, that private building, that poor guy pays more taxes a year than the whole arcade does, and so forth, and great little business, and my favorite old club, Nickety's, over in the jewelry district. So there have been, of course, I think you could cite certain businesses that have moved or aren't there anymore, but I think I don't think it's the mall, and again, I agree with you that some of that churn is, say, between a mall environment and there, not necessarily between the Warwick Mall and the Providence Place Mall. I'm sure that there's some of that aspect. We don't have a good enough statistical way to truly understand what happened with that deal, and it's one of those things I'd love to see somebody, an economist that really had the time to try and sift the data on that. It would be very interesting.
Well, and to your point, earlier in the show, you may not have been, probably weren't listening, but what I continue to point out is, for a variety of issues surrounding, say, for example, the Paw Sox, we continue to make these economic decisions in a vacuum. We make decisions in the state routinely that we don't even know if they're going to be quote unquote revenue neutral. Not that the objective of these investments should be tax revenue, but we have no concept of the impending doom we may be creating when we do these. I look at one of the geniuses to me of Vincent A. Buddy Cianci was that he was one of the first on a large scale in the country to realize that downtown shopping districts were no longer going to be centers of industry or even really shopping, that they were going to be entertainment venues. But when you look at the type of subsidies that artificially drew money away from downtown into a mall, and we all know there's a period in whether it's a mall or a stadium or a casino, when they're first built, there's a year or two honeymoon there, where there's a newness. The novelty begets success almost unto itself. It's sort of like that new restaurant that gets a little bit of buzz, and people stop going to the old ones. So the frustration is that while they were doing such outright harm, they failed to recognize the impact, or they just ignored it. I think they just ignored it. And whereas Cianci came up with the notion of a sales tax-free art district, I think we need, well, first of all, we don't need sales tax anywhere because taxation is in fact theft. But the recognition that, particularly if you want to do economic targeting, perhaps talk about a lower or elimination of sales tax well, everywhere, but particularly in areas where, you're throwing an economic grenade in the center of downtown Providence, and these people were left to fend for themselves. I mean, the carnage is still evident here, and the mall's been open for how many years? So
but I mean, those are good points. I mean, but they go to the issue that the subsidies that are being given, for instance, the subsidy to the mall, the much larger subsidy was the property tax forgiveness by the city.
Right.
And the city doesn't really get, and this is why, one wonders, that the only thing they got out of it is the whatever reputational effect there is purportedly of having something like the mall. They get zero money out of it. And the state, at least, the people that work there, pay income tax. Sales tax are collected there. And so the state actually got off like next to scot-free when you consider that. And these are the kind of policies. Look, the state demanded the ability to give tax abatements to anybody who was building to property tax abatements, right? They took the city's power to abate property taxes, and they basically handed it to the Commerce Commission in order to get anybody to build anything in the I-195 land.
That's just
and
unbelievable.
It should be the state. Look, if the state wants to give subsidies for people to build there, ideally it would be businesses, and not apartments to compete with people who are already here. But if the state wants to give subsidies because they think they're going to get people paying sales tax and paying income tax, great. But the state is buying this development with taxpayers' money from Providence.
Right.
I mean, that's a gross embarrassment.
I just realized, Brian, that we've gone way over. But the conversation was great. I thank you so much for calling in tonight.
Okay. Hey, well, great. It's great to talk to you, Pat. We can agree or disagree, but it is good to talk to you.
No, I really enjoy it as well, Brian. And you remember back, it was just a few years ago, you were in studio with me when we were at WPRO.
Yeah.
I think we need to try and figure out the logistics of doing some type of development roundtable with Monique, myself, you, and maybe someone else, and just to really spend a couple hours just continue to flesh out this issue.
That's it. Well, I didn't really mean to steal Monique's thunder, but she said you were going to talk about energy, so that's why I called, and thanks so much for having me. Have a good night.
All right, buddy. Thank you so much.
Brian.
He is a force of nature, if nothing else.
But very knowledgeable, very knowledgeable.
One of the smartest guys. He's quietly involved in the body politic, as they say, but extremely knowledgeable and obviously completely in touch with the situation.
Exactly. We
ran way over. We didn't get a chance to talk about center stuff, but I think you're going to be a continued presence here. So,
great.
So, and in fact, I'd invite you at some point to write something that, specifically for the coalition blog under perhaps the senator's imprimatur or Stop Tolls RI.
We did issue a statement this week about the electric rate increase. Please visit rifreedom.org to see that statement. And it presaged a lot of what Brian said in terms of causes.
Right. And this is the kind of open debate that has to happen.
Exactly.
Minus the acrimony, minus the identity politics. I still remain completely opposed to the power plant in Burrowville. I see a different window for solar power than I think Brian does. And I'm a big believer in community rights and community self-determination. Mm-hmm. So I will continue to oppose that, even though he and I may agree to disagree on the ISO auctions. Well,
thank you.
Folks, we've gone way over. But this is, in fact, do we have to unhandcuff Tony back there?
Poor Tony.
Tony, you still back there?
He's snoring.
Folks, you've been listening to an extended version of the Coalition on the Worldwide Coalition Media Network. As I said earlier in the show, we've got a couple of great guests coming on next week. We are purportedly having the folks from FIRE, which is a national organization representing free speech issues at the campus level that dovetails very nicely with our visitor from last week, where we discussed enabling legislation in states that demanded free speech. Jody's going to be on. We're going to be talking about dyslexia. not exactly political, but clearly there are political ramifications to how children in city schools, municipal schools, town schools with special needs are supported in the guise of the ever expanding scope of education in this state. And I believe we'll probably have some continued input from Monique. So we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Media Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, here in the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island. The Naked City, the city of 1,000 stories. Today, I believe we told a few. Folks, there's still time to head out to the Met Cafe tonight, down in the Bucket. A wonderful, wonderful festival, if you will, benefit concert being held from our friend Steve Maysill, 1in52.net. Folks, clearly everyone here tonight takes things very, very personally, whether it be our friends from LEAP, whether it be our good friend Monique Chartier.
That's the Chardonnay.
Wow. From this Rhode Island Center for Freedom and Prosperity, whether it be our good friend Brian Bishop, libertarian and man about town. Folks, take it personally, visit the site, support our advertisers, support our advertisers, support our advertisers, support our advertisers.